The story of the Huns begins not with Rome, nor even with Europe, but far out on the endless horizon of the Eurasian steppe. Imagine yourself beneath a boundless sky, where the land seems to roll forever in waves of grass, interrupted only by rivers and the silhouettes of horse herds. This is the crucible of nomadic empires, the same landscape that would one day produce the Mongols, the Turks, and countless other steppe confederations. And somewhere, in this shifting sea of peoples, the Huns emerged. The problem for historians is that the Huns' origins are cloaked in mystery. Roman authors, who later chronicled their terrifying raids into Europe, admitted they did not know where these people had come from. To them, the Huns simply appeared like a storm from the east, a human tempest rolling across the frontier. Some writers speculated they were spawned from demons, others that they descended from the Scythians, those ancient horsemen known to Greek historians. Modern scholarship paints a more complex picture. The Huns may have originated from the Xiongnu Confederation, a vast nomadic empire that challenged China during the Han dynasty. Centuries of pressure, defeats, and migrations could have pushed fragments of these people westward, mingling with Turkic and Iranian groups. By the time they reached the fringes of Europe in the 4th century CE, they had become a new identity altogether. The Huns. Their language remains debated. Was it Turkic, Mongolic, a blend of steppe dialects? The evidence is too thin to be certain. What is clear is that the Huns inherited the lifeways of the steppe mobility, horsemanship, and raiding as both survival and art. Their identity was not bound to cities or walls, but to open pastures and the thundering hooves of their mounts. The Romans, when they first described them, focused not on their culture but their alien appearance. Writers like Ammianus Marcellinus portrayed the Huns as almost inhuman scarred faces, squat builds, eyes like fire. These depictions were meant to terrify Roman audiences, but beneath the exaggeration lies a kernel of truth. The Huns were unlike anything Rome had faced before. Their lives, shaped by the vast steppe, had molded them into riders, archers, and warriors from the moment they could walk. Thus, the Huns arrived in history not as a nation with a founding date, but as a shadow moving across the grasslands, impossible to pin down. The first clear mention of the Huns in European history comes in the 372nd CE. At that time, the Roman world was already fragile. The empire had been split into eastern and western halves, plagued by internal strife, religious debates, and constant pressure on its frontiers. Germanic tribes pressed along the Danube and Rhine. Goths lingered near the Black Sea, restless and powerful. And then suddenly, the Huns appeared. The accounts tell us that the Huns crossed the Volga River, sweeping into the lands of the Alans, an Iranian-speaking people of the steppe. The Alans, renowned horsemen themselves, could not withstand the fury of the Hunnic advance. They were slaughtered, absorbed, or driven westward. From there, the Huns surged toward the Gothic kingdoms north of the Black Sea. The Goths had built formidable states, balancing between independence and uneasy diplomacy with Rome. Yet they were utterly unprepared for the speed and violence of the Huns. Entire villages vanished overnight. Fields and homes were torched. Gothic leaders scrambled to resist. But the Huns struck with swarms of horse archers, who seemed to appear and disappear at will. The effect on Europe was immediate and catastrophic. The Goths, shattered by the Huns, fled southward toward the Danube River, begging for sanctuary within Roman territory. Rome, unable to fully control the crisis, allowed thousands of Gothic refugees into its lands, but their mistreatment sparked rebellion, leading to the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where a Roman emperor was killed and Roman armies decimated. Thus, even before the Huns directly threatened Rome, Their arrival had already destabilized the empire. By driving the Goths and other tribes westward, they created a domino effect, a chain reaction of migrations, invasions, and collapses that would eventually help topple the Western Roman Empire. The Huns themselves gained more than plunder in these early years. They acquired knowledge of Roman tactics, captured weapons, and even skilled artisans who could forge iron stirrups, armor, and siege equipment. Every raid was both destruction and apprenticeship. In these decades, the Huns were less a unified empire and more a confederation of warbands led by ambitious chiefs. Their strength lay in their mobility and terror. Villages abandoned at the rumor of their approach. Whole tribes migrated simply to escape them. To the settled peoples of Europe, the Huns seemed like ghosts riders who came with the wind and vanished into the horizon. To understand the Huns' impact, we must look closer at their way of life. Unlike the Romans, who built stone cities, aqueducts, and forums, the Huns lived in felt tents, herding their animals across the grasslands. Their wealth was measured not in marble, but in herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. Their homes could be dismantled, packed onto wagons, and moved within hours. They were a people in perpetual motion. The horse was the soul of Hunnic culture. Roman observers noted that Huns seemed to live in the saddle. Boys learned to ride before they could properly walk. They ate, hunted, fought, and even slept on horseback. Each warrior maintained multiple mounts, switching to fresh horses during long campaigns. This gave them unmatched endurance. While Roman infantry marched 20 miles in a day, Hun cavalry could cover 60 or more. Their weapon of choice was the composite bow, a marvel of steppe engineering. Crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, it packed enormous power into a small frame. A Hunnic archer could fire accurately at full gallop, unleashing arrows that pierced armor. Roman accounts speak of soldiers falling long before they could close with the Huns. Tactically, the Huns were masters of psychological warfare. They used feigned retreats to lure enemies into ambushes, encircled armies with lightning speed, and relied on confusion as much as force. Their raids were often accompanied by fire and terror, spreading panic before a single arrow was loosed. Culturally, they were a mosaic. As they moved westward, they absorbed Alans, Goths, and other peoples into their confederation. Their chiefs surrounded themselves with diverse retainers, Germanic bodyguards, Roman deserters, and steppe allies. This flexibility made them stronger, allowing them to adapt rapidly to new environments. Religion among the Huns remains murky, but it likely blended shamanism with steppe traditions of ancestor worship. Ritual sacrifices, divination, and reverence for the sky and earth spirits were central. Leaders were seen as chosen by divine favor, their success in battle proof of heaven's blessing. To their enemies, the Huns seemed barbaric. To themselves, they were heirs of the eternal steppe, destined to dominate those who hid behind walls. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Huns were no longer just raiders on the fringes. They were becoming a power in their own right, feared by Rome, envied by rival tribes, and ready to carve a place in history. In the closing decades of the 4th century, Europe was already a fragile place. The Roman Empire had split into eastern and western halves, both struggling with corruption, infighting, and growing pressure along their borders. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were never quiet. Germanic tribes pressed restlessly against Rome's limes, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, sometimes asking for land. Yet despite the tension, Rome still seemed eternal. Cities bustled, legions guarded roads, taxes filled the coffers. And then, suddenly, something new appeared on the horizon. The Huns. They did not arrive like the Vandals or the Franks, with wagons of families seeking farmland. They did not move like the Goths, who had long dealt with Rome and and spoke Latin prayers. The Huns came as horsemen from the east, swift, brutal, and alien to Roman eyes. Their first recorded appearance in Europe came around the 372nd CE, and it began with the Alans, a proud Iranian-speaking people living north of the Black Sea. The Alans had long been known for their cavalry, fighting as mercenaries for both Rome and Persia. But when the Huns swept across their territory, the Alans were broken with astonishing speed. Their riders, skilled though they were, could not match the relentless mobility of Hun horsemen who seemed to live in the saddle. Some Alans were killed outright, others fled westward, many were absorbed into the Hunnic host. This became a recurring pattern: defeat, absorption, and expansion. From the Alans, the Huns turned toward the Gothic kingdoms of the Tervings and Greuthungs, settled near the Black Sea. The Goths had established organized polities with kings, councils, and fortified settlements. They were not unprepared for war, but they had never seen anything like the Huns. Raiding bands appeared seemingly out of nowhere, moving faster than scouts could report. Villages burned, leaders were cut down, herds stolen, entire communities shattered. The Goths fled. Some resisted, but resistance often meant annihilation. Driven from their homes, vast numbers surged toward the Danube River, begging Rome for sanctuary. This single movement of people, triggered by the first Hunnic raids, had consequences that reshaped the empire itself. Rome, overwhelmed by the refugee crisis, agreed to admit Gothic groups into imperial territory. But corruption among Roman officials ensured the Goths were mistreated, starved, and exploited. Desperation turned to rebellion, and rebellion exploded into the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE. There, the Gothic leader, Fritigern, crushed a Roman army, killing Emperor Valens and annihilating 2/3 of his men. The Huns had not fought at Adrianople, yet the battle was their shadow work. By driving the Goths before them, they had set the dominoes falling. Rome, which had survived Hannibal, Parthia, and countless Germanic wars, now saw its very heartlands threatened. The Huns had announced themselves not through embassies or proclamations, but through chaos unleashed on others. Their first raids into Europe thus achieved more than plunder. They destabilized a continent, exposed Rome's weakness, and inaugurated an age of migration and invasion that would, in time, topple the Western Roman Empire itself. As the 4th century gave way to the 5th, the Huns moved deeper into Europe. Their raids were no longer confined to the distant steppes. They now pressed against Roman provinces themselves. Thrace, Illyricum, and Pannonia, all once secure borderlands, found themselves harassed by riders who seemed to materialize from mist. To Roman eyes, these men were monsters. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, described them with horror. They are almost glued to their horses, unshapely of form, dark of face, living more like beasts than men. He claimed they scarred their children's cheeks with knives to prevent beard growth, making them appear inhuman. His words are exaggerated, but they reveal how deeply unsettling the Huns were to Rome. What disturbed the Romans most was not just the savagery of raids, but the style of warfare. Roman heavy infantry had been designed for set-piece battles, shield walls, and steady advances. Against the Huns, these formations collapsed. The Hun composite bow, small, recurved, and immensely powerful, allowed mounted archers to unleash devastating volleys while galloping. They could fire, retreat, wheel, and fire again, never giving an enemy the satisfaction of close combat. Roman units struggled to respond. Cavalry auxiliaries could chase them, But the Huns' endurance was unmatched. Infantry legions could form defenses, but the Huns would simply bypass them, striking at towns, villages, or supply lines. Rome's proud fortifications were reduced to cages, protecting cities but leaving the countryside at the mercy of raiders. Diplomacy soon followed. Roman envoys tried to bribe and negotiate, offering gold, livestock, and annual tribute in exchange for peace. But to the Huns, tribute was not appeasement, it was acknowledgement of superiority. Each payment only emboldened them to demand more. They began to think of Rome not as a rival, but as a treasury to be milked. Meanwhile, irony played its part. Even as the Huns raided Roman provinces, they were also hired as Roman mercenaries. Generals desperate for cavalry skill recruited Hun warbands, setting them against other tribes or even rival Roman factions. The Huns fought fiercely for pay, but loyalty meant little. A Hun might ride beside a Roman one year, then return as a raider the next. To Rome, the encounter was humiliating. The empire that had once bent the Mediterranean to its will now paid tribute to tribes it could neither defeat nor fully control. The first direct contacts with the Huns revealed a new reality. Rome was no longer master of its frontiers. Perhaps the greatest triumph of the Huns in this early period was not measured in silver or slaves, but in fear. News of their coming often arrived before their riders, whispered by survivors or carried by terrified refugees. In some cases, entire provinces dissolved into panic at mere rumor. Farmers abandoned their fields. Peasants fled into walled towns. Villages emptied without a single arrow being fired. This terror was not accidental, it was a weapon. The Huns understood that psychological warfare magnified their strength. A raid that killed hundreds could scatter tens of thousands if fear spread unchecked. Roman chroniclers, whether intentionally or not, amplified this effect. Ammianus painted them as almost supernatural. Faces marked with scars, squat bodies bent like beasts, voices that hissed rather than spoke. To readers in Constantinople or Milan, the Huns seemed less like men and more like omens of apocalypse. Fear also reshaped geopolitics. Tribes that once defied Rome, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi now begged for Roman protection against the Huns. Ironically, this only deepened the empire's crisis. By granting asylum to displaced tribes, Rome burdened itself with hungry mouths and restless warriors who often turned rebellious. By refusing asylum, Rome drove those same tribes into open hostility. Either way, the Huns benefited. Their presence turned every frontier into a tinderbox. For ordinary Romans, the fear was existential. The empire had always claimed to be eternal, blessed by the gods. Yet now, stories told of invisible horsemen who came with the wind, burned towns, and vanished before legions could march. Priests proclaimed omens. Villagers muttered that the end of days had come. To many, the Huns were no mere invaders. They were divine punishment, the scourge of God. By the dawn of the 5th century, the fear of the Huns was universal. They had destabilized kingdoms, humbled Rome, and reshaped migration across Europe. But they had not yet reached their full potential. They remained a confederation of warbands, fierce but fragmented, terrifying but leaderless. The true storm had not yet broken. That storm would come with a single man, one whose name would echo through the centuries. Attila. By the early 5th century, the Huns had evolved from a terrifying wave of raiders into a political power. They had shattered Gothic kingdoms, forced Romans into uneasy alliances, and drawn countless smaller tribes into their orbit. Yet, they lacked a central figure, someone who could take their scattered warbands and forge them into a true empire. That moment arrived in the 432nd CE, with the rise of two brothers, Attila and Bleda. Little is known of their early lives. They were nephews of Rua, sometimes called Rugila, a powerful Hun leader who had established dominance over large swathes of the Danube frontier. Rua had already been extracting tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, demanding annual payments of gold in exchange for peace. When Rua died around 434 CE, his nephews inherited his authority. Attila and Bleda ruled jointly at first, sharing power in the tradition of many steppe confederations. At their accession, the Huns were already feared, but under these two brothers, they began to act with new precision. Unlike earlier chieftains, Attila and Bleda saw themselves not merely as warband leaders, but as rulers of a confederation stretching across the plains of Central Europe. They commanded not only Huns, but Alans, Goths, and countless other peoples who had been absorbed into their ranks. This diversity created challenges, but it also gave the Huns unprecedented strength. Their headquarters lay somewhere in the Hungarian plain, the heartland of Hunnic power. From there, they could strike in any direction, east toward the steppes, west toward the Rhine, or south into the Balkans. Their court was described by Roman envoys as austere but imposing. Attila, in particular, was noted for his simplicity. He rejected lavish dress and golden goblets, favoring iron and wooden vessels, eating modestly and appearing as a man of discipline. His charisma, however, was unmistakable. Though Attila would later eclipse his brother in fame, at this stage the two ruled together, and together they would bring Rome to its knees. The first major encounter between Attila, Bleda, and the Eastern Roman Empire came in 434 CE, when the brothers negotiated a treaty with Emperor Theodosius II. The agreement, known as the Treaty of Margus, was humiliating for Rome. Under its terms, the Romans promised to pay the Huns an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold, nearly double what had been paid to Rua. They also agreed to return any Hunnic refugees and fugitives, essentially recognizing Attila and Bleda's right to control their own people wherever they might flee. And perhaps most humiliating of all, Rome accepted that the Huns were their equals in diplomacy. For the Huns, tribute was more than wealth. It was a symbol of dominance. To the Romans, the payments were bribes to keep the frontier quiet. To the Huns, they were proof that the empire feared them. Each gold piece was a coin of submission, but treaties with the Huns were fragile things. When Rome failed to meet the terms, the brothers responded with devastating raids. In 441, they launched a campaign into the Balkans, striking with speed and ferocity. Cities fell one after another. Margus itself, the very city where the humiliating treaty had been signed, was sacked. Viminacium, Singidunum, and Sirmium, important urban centers, were overrun. Roman defenses were stretched thin. The empire was also embroiled in wars with the Vandals and Persians, leaving its Balkan frontier exposed. Attila and Bleda exploited this weakness mercilessly. By 443, their armies had reached as far as Naissus, modern Niš in Serbia, crushing Roman field forces and laying waste to the countryside. The devastation shocked Constantinople. Refugees poured into the capital, bringing tales of slaughter and ruin. Theodosius II had little choice but to sue for peace. Another treaty followed, this one even harsher. The tribute was raised to 2,100 pounds of gold annually. Fugitives were to be returned without exception. Trade was restricted to certain posts under Hunnic supervision. Rome bled gold, but for the Huns, these payments funded more campaigns, more warriors, more power. Each raid and treaty was part of a calculated strategy. Strike, demand, tribute, enrich the confederation, and return again. Diplomacy was a weapon, and Rome was its victim. While Rome was humiliated, the Huns were consolidating. Attila and Bleda were not content with raids alone. They sought to weld their diverse followers into a durable confederation. The Hunnic host was a mosaic of peoples, Huns at its core, but surrounded by subject Goths, Alans, Gepids, Siri, Rugii, and countless smaller tribes. Each brought their own traditions, languages, and leaders. To unify them, the brothers relied on both terror and reward. Terror ensured loyalty. Defiance was met with swift execution. Tribal leaders who resisted were crushed, their people absorbed. The fate of those who opposed the Huns served as a warning to others. At the same time, reward bound allies closer. Chiefs who submitted were allowed to retain authority, provided they supplied warriors for campaigns. Loot and tribute were distributed not only to Hunnic elites, but also to allied contingents, ensuring everyone had a stake in victory. The brothers also cultivated an image of divine favor. Steppe traditions held that success in war was proof of heaven's blessing. The constant victories over Romans reinforced the belief that Attila and Bleda were chosen leaders. This aura of destiny helped cement their rule. By the mid-442s, the Huns stood as the most powerful force in Eastern Europe. Their confederation stretched from the steppes to the borders of Gaul, a vast and mobile empire with no rival in mobility or ferocity. And yet, their joint rule was not to last. Sometime around 445 CE, Attila killed or deposed his brother Bleda. The details are murky. Some sources suggest murder, others a natural death. But what is certain is that Attila emerged as sole ruler. With his ascension, the Huns entered their most famous and terrifying phase. But before Attila could earn his title as the Scourge of God, he had to finish what he and Bleda had begun, forcing Rome to recognize the supremacy of the Huns, not just as raiders, but as a true empire. When Attila emerged as the sole leader of the Huns around 445 CE, the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically. The death of his brother Bleda, whether by natural causes, accident, or murder orchestrated by Attila himself, cleared the way for a single will to direct the sprawling Hunnic confederation. No longer shared between brothers, the energy of the Huns now focused entirely through one man. Attila was unlike the flamboyant rulers Rome had known. He did not drape himself in silks, nor recline at banquets dripping with gold. Contemporary observers marveled at his austerity. While his lieutenants dined from silver, Attila preferred simple wooden dishes. While others wore colorful robes, he chose plain garments. His power was not broadcast through extravagance, but through fear and discipline. This simplicity masked an extraordinary political mind. Attila understood that the Hunnic confederation was fragile, a patchwork of tribes held together by fear, loyalty, and the lure of plunder. He moved constantly to maintain its cohesion, rewarding loyal chiefs with spoils, executing rivals swiftly, and reminding all that he carried the favor of heaven. Victories in war confirmed his destiny. Defeat was not tolerated. His court, described by Roman envoys like Priscus of Panium, was both austere and intimidating. Priscus tells of a visit in which Roman ambassadors were received in a large wooden hall, richly adorned but lacking the opulence of Constantinople. Attila sat at the center, silent and watchful, drinking from a simple cup. Around him, nobles laughed and feasted, but he remained solemn. This balance of modesty and menace was deliberate. It elevated him above his men, while projecting an image of incorruptible authority. By consolidating power, Attila transformed the Huns from a confederation of raiding bands into something resembling an empire. Their reach extended across Central Europe, their armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Now, their campaigns would not simply raid the Balkans for gold. they would threaten the very survival of Rome itself. With Attila at the helm, the Huns unleashed devastation on the Eastern Roman Empire. In 447 CE, he launched one of the most destructive campaigns the Balkans had ever seen. The pretext, as always, was Rome's failure to meet treaty obligations. Tribute payments were delayed, fugitives sheltered, terms broken. For Attila, these infractions were excuses to march. But beneath the excuses lay strategy. The Balkans were Rome's vulnerable flank, rich with cities but poorly defended after decades of neglect and overextension. The campaign began with speed. Hun cavalry poured through the Danube frontier, bypassing fortresses, overwhelming small garrisons, and striking directly at urban centers. Cities like Naissus, Serdica, and Philippopolis fell in rapid succession. Archaeological evidence suggests Naissus was left in ruins for decades afterward, its streets littered with the bones of the dead. The Roman field army attempted to resist, but was decisively defeated. An earthquake that same year had damaged Constantinople's walls, leaving the capital itself exposed. Panic gripped the empire. Had Attila pressed his advantage immediately, Constantinople might have fallen. But instead, he halted, whether due to logistical strain, disease, or strategic calculation, remains debated. Still, the message was clear. The Eastern Roman Empire was powerless to stop him. Theodosius II had no choice but to negotiate. The resulting treaty was humiliating. The tribute was raised to an astronomical £6,000 of gold annually, plus 12 solidi for every Roman prisoner released. Land along the Danube was ceded. The empire was bled dry in gold, paying for peace that was never secure. The devastation of the Balkans had lasting consequences. Entire provinces were depopulated. Economies collapsed. Survivors fled to fortified cities or into the mountains. Rome's authority in the region crumbled. Attila, meanwhile, had enriched himself and strengthened his hold over his followers. For the Huns, this was more than plunder. It was proof that the greatest empire of the age could be humbled again and again. For Rome, it was a reminder that survival now depended on buying time with treasure. By the late 442s, the Eastern Roman Empire existed in a state of uneasy submission. Tribute flowed eastward in steady streams of gold, filling Attila's coffers and ensuring the loyalty of his warriors. But peace with the Huns was never truly peace. It was extortion, fragile and temporary. Constantinople lived in fear of Attila's whims. A missed payment, a perceived slight, or a failure to return fugitives could bring devastation again. Roman envoys travelled frequently to his court, humbling themselves before a man their ancestors would have dismissed as a barbarian chieftain. Each embassy underscored Rome's decline and the Huns' ascendancy. Yet within this fragile peace lay complexity. Attila did not seek to annihilate Rome outright, at least, not yet. The empire was too valuable as a source of gold and resources. Destroying it would remove the very treasury that fed his power. Instead, he maintained a calculated balance. Raid enough to terrify, extort enough to enrich, but leave Rome standing as a perpetual victim. Priscus, the envoy, provides a rare glimpse into these diplomatic exchanges. He describes conversations with Attila's advisors, feasts where Hun nobles boasted of victories, and moments where cultural differences stood stark. Romans marveled at Hun horsemanship, their simple living, their brutality in war. The Huns, in turn, regarded Rome as decadent, soft, and ripe for exploitation. The uneasy peace also bought Attila time to consolidate his power further. He tightened control over subject tribes, drew new peoples into his orbit, and prepared for greater campaigns. The Balkans had been ravaged, but the richest prize of all still lay beyond: the Western Roman Empire. weakened by internal strife, stretched thin across Gaul and Italy. Thus, the peace of the late 440 was not an end, but an interlude, a breath before the storm. Rome clung to survival with gold, but gold could only delay the inevitable. Attila was watching, waiting, and preparing. His reign of terror had only just begun. By the early 452 CE, Attila had already made the Eastern Roman Empire his tributary in all but name. Gold flowed steadily into his coffers, enriching his nobles and ensuring the loyalty of the diverse peoples who formed the Hunnic Confederation. Yet, Attila was restless. He had ravaged the Balkans, humiliated Constantinople, and extracted staggering sums. But the hunger for conquest was not sated. His gaze now turned west, toward the lands of Gaul, and beyond the heartlands of the Western Roman Empire. The West was weaker than the East. While Constantinople still boasted wealth, fortifications, and a functioning bureaucracy, the Western Empire was crumbling under its own weight. Internal strife, barbarian invasions, and dwindling resources had hollowed out its strength. Gaul was fractured, its cities vulnerable. Rival tribes, including Visigoths and Burgundians, carved their own domains within imperial territory. Attila saw opportunity. In 451 CE, he launched one of the most ambitious campaigns of his career, a massive invasion of Gaul. The pretext was political. Attila claimed that Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had sent him a ring and appealed for rescue from a forced marriage. Attila interpreted this as a marriage proposal and demanded half the empire as dowry. When Rome refused, Attila declared war. With an army numbering perhaps 200,000, by some accounts, though modern estimates suggest closer to 50,000, 70,000, he swept westward. His forces were not only Huns, but also Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and countless other allies, bound to his cause. Together, they represented one of the largest coalitions the steppe had ever hurled at Rome. The march was devastating. Cities fell one after another. Metz was burned, Trier was sacked, Orléans was besieged. Refugees fled in all directions, carrying tales of slaughter. To many, it seemed the West would suffer the same fate as the Balkans. A trail of fire and ruin left in Attila's wake. But Rome was not entirely helpless. A general named Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, recognized the threat. Aetius had spent years among the Huns in his youth, even serving as a hostage at their court. He understood their tactics and their leader. Rallying what strength remained, Aetius forged a desperate alliance. He called upon the Visigoths under King Theodoric I, the Franks, and other Germanic tribes who saw in Attila a common threat. Remarkably, Rome and its former enemies now stood side by side. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any Europe had seen in centuries. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. In June 451 CE, the two forces met on the plains near Chalons, in northeastern Gaul. The clash would become one of the last great battles of the Western Roman Empire and a defining moment in the history of the Huns. Attila positioned his forces strategically. His center was held by Hunnic horse archers, the hammer of his army. On his flanks stood his Gothic and Germanic allies, loyal through both fear and plunder. Behind him, wagons formed a defensive laager, protecting supplies and offering refuge in case of retreat. Attila himself took command at the center, the heart of the storm. Facing him stood Aetius and his coalition. The Romans and Visigoths formed the backbone, supported by Franks and other tribes. Theodoric I, the Visigothic king, commanded his cavalry with ferocity, while Aetius orchestrated the larger battle with a veteran's precision. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Hunnic archers rained volleys of arrows, darkening the sky. Roman infantry held firm, shields raised. while Visigothic cavalry surged forward to meet the Germanic allies of Attila. Dust and blood mingled on the plains as thousands clashed. At the height of the battle, Theodoric I fell trampled in the melee or slain by an enemy spear. Accounts differ. His death might have shattered Visigoth morale, but instead it inflamed them. Enraged, the Visigoths pressed harder, driving back Attila's allies. Meanwhile, Attila himself faced crisis. Surrounded by mounting losses, he retreated to his wagon fortress, fearing total annihilation. According to legend, he prepared a funeral pyre of saddles, vowing to throw himself into the flames rather than be captured. But fate spared him. Aetius, wary of destroying the Huns entirely, perhaps fearing Visigoth dominance, if Attila were eliminated, allowed the Huns to withdraw. The battle ended without a clear victor, but strategically it was a turning point. Attila had been stopped. His myth of invincibility was broken. The West, though battered, had held. The plains of Chalons were littered with corpses, tens of thousands dead. Chroniclers spoke of rivers running red with blood, of earth soaked with carnage. Though exaggerated, the devastation was real. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the late ancient world. For Attila, it was a rare setback. He had not been destroyed, but neither had he triumphed. His western campaign had faltered, yet the scourge of God was not finished. The aftermath of the Catalonian plains revealed the shifting fortunes of both Rome and the Huns. For Rome, the battle was a momentary reprieve. Aetius was hailed as savior of the West, the man who had stopped Attila. For the Visigoths, it was bittersweet. Their king lay dead, but their valor had turned the tide. For Attila, the campaign was a disappointment. He had ravaged Gaul, besieged cities, and assembled the greatest army of his career. Yet he had been checked. His aura of unstoppable destiny was cracked, if not shattered. Allies who once saw him as invincible now questioned his strength. Still, Attila was far from defeated. The Huns remained a formidable power, their confederation intact, their cavalry unmatched. If Gaul had resisted, perhaps Italy would fall. Indeed, Attila soon turned his gaze southward. In 452 CE, he would cross the Alps and march into Italy itself, bringing terror to the very heart of the Western Roman Empire. Rome, once mistress of the world, would find itself groveling before the scourge of God. But for now, on the blood-soaked fields of Chalons, the tide had shifted. The Huns were no longer a rising storm, they were a storm checked, and in that fragile balance, the fate of empires hung. The year 452 CE dawned with ominous clouds over the Western Roman Empire. The battered realm had narrowly survived Attila's campaign in Gaul the previous year, but the threat had not disappeared. Attila had withdrawn, yet his armies remained intact. He had not been broken, only stalled. To many observers, it was only a matter of time before the scourge of God turned his wrath upon Italy itself, the symbolic heart of the Roman world. The pretext came swiftly. Attila invoked the earlier claim of marriage to Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, insisting that half the Western Empire was his rightful dowry. Valentinian refused, but Attila framed this rejection as both insult and justification for war. With Rome weakened and divided, the opportunity was irresistible. Gathering his forces, Attila led the Huns and their allies across the Julian Alps. The advance was as swift as it was devastating. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. Aquileia, one of the great cities of northern Italy, became the most infamous victim. Contemporary accounts describe how Attila besieged it with relentless determination. The Huns, lacking Rome's monumental siege traditions, nevertheless adapted quickly, employing captured engineers and crude machines to batter the defenses. After weeks of resistance, Aquileia's walls crumbled. What followed shocked the empire. The city was not merely sacked, it was annihilated. Its inhabitants were slaughtered or enslaved, Its buildings burned to the ground. Legends later claimed that Aquileia was so thoroughly destroyed that not even its ruins could be found. Refugees who fled into the marshes of the Venetian lagoon would one day give rise to the city of Venice, a lasting reminder of the Hunnic terror. From Aquileia, Attila's horde swept across the fertile plains of the Po Valley. Town after town fell. Concordia, Altinum, Padua, Verona. Survivors poured southward, carrying tales of horror. Crops were destroyed, villages leveled, and entire regions depopulated. Famine stalked the land, not only from the Huns' depredations, but from the disruption of harvests. The advance seemed unstoppable. Attila marched toward Milan, the imperial capital of the West. Panic gripped the empire. Valentinian fled to Ravenna, leaving Italy's heartland exposed. The Senate, clergy, and populace alike feared that Rome itself, once the mistress of the world, would soon suffer the same fate as Aquileia. And yet, amid this terror, events would take a remarkable turn. As Attila pressed deeper into Italy, a delegation was sent to parley with him. At its head was Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great. He was accompanied by prominent Roman officials, including the former consul Gennadius Avienus. Together, they journeyed north to meet the conqueror. The encounter took place near the banks of the river Mincio, not far from Mantua. The details of their conversation are lost to history. No contemporary Roman source records exactly what was said, and later legends embellished the event with dramatic flourishes. One tradition claimed that the apostles Peter and Paul appeared in vision beside Leo, warning Attila not to touch Rome. Another suggested that Attila was awed by the Pope's personal authority and charisma. More practical historians propose that famine, disease, and the threat of Eastern Roman reinforcements compelled him to reconsider further advance. What is certain is that Attila, astonishingly, turned back. Rome was spared. The Pope returned as a hero, credited with saving the Eternal City through diplomacy and divine favor. In Christian memory, the meeting became a symbol of spiritual authority triumphing over brute force. For Attila, however, the retreat was pragmatic. His armies were weakened by hunger and plague, northern Italy's resources already exhausted. Moreover, Eastern Roman forces under Marcian threatened his rear if he lingered too long. To continue southward risked disaster. Thus, in a moment that would echo through history, the scourge of God withdrew from Italy. Yet this was not a triumph for Rome so much as a reprieve. Attila remained alive, his armies still formidable. Rumors spread that he intended to strike again, perhaps against Constantinople or even into the Balkans. Europe trembled, waiting for his next move. But fate would intervene. In 453 CE, scarcely a year after his invasion of Italy, Attila died. The circumstances were sudden and shrouded in mystery. According to the historian Priscus, he perished on his wedding night after marrying a young Gothic bride named Ildico. The cause was said to be a burst blood vessel, choking him in his sleep. Other sources suggested poisoning or assassination. Whatever the truth, the mighty conqueror who had shaken empires was gone in an instant. The shock reverberated through the Hunnic world. Attila had been more than a warlord. He was the linchpin of the Confederation. His charisma, ruthlessness, and success had bound together a coalition of diverse peoples. Huns, Goths, Gepids, Alans, and others who otherwise had little reason to cooperate. With him gone, the fragile unity unraveled. His sons attempted to divide the empire among themselves. Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak each claimed authority. But rivalry soon turned to conflict. Subject peoples, long held in check by fear, seized the chance to break free. The Goths, Gepids, and others rebelled. The breaking point came at the Battle of Nidau in 454 CE. There, the sons of Attila faced a coalition of their former subjects. The result was catastrophic for the Huns. Their confederation shattered, their dominance evaporated. The once terrifying horsemen who had humbled Rome were driven back into the steppes. Within a generation, the Huns had vanished as a major power. Yet, their legacy endured. They had accelerated the decline of Rome, reshaped the map of Europe, and left memories so vivid that centuries later, their names still evoked terror. The story of their rise and fall was not merely that of a nomadic horde, but of a people who, for a brief, blazing moment, altered the course of history. Attila's sudden death in 453 CE left the Hunnic Confederation leaderless at the very moment it needed strength most. He had been the unifying figure, the one whose charisma and military success bound together dozens of tribes: Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, Rugii, Heruli, and others. Without him, there was no consensus on leadership, only rivalry. Three of his sons, Elak, Dengizich, and Ernak, rose to prominence. Each believed he was the rightful heir, but there was no established system of succession within the Hunnic world. Unlike Rome, with its bureaucratic machinery, or China, with its dynastic traditions, the Huns followed a more fluid and personal model of authority. A leader was obeyed not because of hereditary law, but because of his proven power. Elak, the eldest, assumed the title of King of the Huns and sought to maintain dominance over subject tribes. But his authority was immediately contested. Many of these tribes had submitted to Attila out of fear rather than loyalty. With the scourge of God gone, they no longer felt bound to serve. To them, the Huns were not eternal overlords, but one more conqueror whose time had passed. The Ostrogoths, in particular, saw opportunity. Subjugated by the Huns for decades, they longed for independence. The Gepids, another powerful tribe, likewise rose in defiance. Even within the Hunnic elite, factions split, some siding with Elak, others with Dengizich or Ernak. The stage was set for civil war. The Battle of Nidau, in 454 CE, rebellion erupted into full-scale conflict. Ardaric, king of the Gepids, led a coalition of tribes who had once been Attila's subjects, but now sought freedom. This alliance included Ostrogoths, Rugii, Heruli, and Suebi. Against them stood the Huns, commanded by Elek and his brothers, determined to preserve the empire their father had built. The armies met at the river Nidau, in what is now thought to be the Pannonian Basin. Ancient sources describe the battle as massive, though exact numbers are unknown. What is clear is that it was brutal, chaotic, and decisive. The Huns fought with their characteristic cavalry tactics, swift horse archers, raining volleys before closing with sabres and lances. But their enemies had learned from decades under Hun domination. The Ostrogoths and Gepids now deployed disciplined heavy cavalry and infantry formations, capable of withstanding the storm of arrows. The battlefield was a collision not only of armies, but of traditions. Steppe mobility against the solidity of Germanic warriors. The fighting raged for hours. Elak himself is said to have fought valiantly at the center, rallying his men with the same ferocity his father had once displayed. But the tide turned against the Huns. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, their formations began to crumble. When Elak fell slain amid the chaos, the morale of the Huns collapsed. The coalition pressed its advantage, slaughtering thousands. Survivors fled eastward, abandoning the lands they had dominated for nearly a century. The Huns' aura of invincibility was gone forever. The Battle of Nidau was more than just a defeat. It was the death knell of the Hunnic Empire. What Attila had built through fire and blood disintegrated in a single confrontation. From that moment, The Huns ceased to be masters of Europe and became wanderers once more. In the aftermath of Nedao, the Hunnic Confederation shattered beyond repair. Elak's death left Dengizic and Ernach to pick up the pieces, but their authority extended only over fragments of the once great empire. Some Huns retreated into the Carpathian Basin, clinging to diminished power. Others drifted back toward the Pontic steppes, blending with Alans, Bulgars, and other nomadic peoples. Dengizic attempted to rally the Huns for renewed campaigns. In the 462nd, he led raids against the Eastern Roman Empire, hoping to reclaim the tribute that had once flowed into his father's coffers. But these efforts ended in failure. The Eastern Romans, stronger now under Emperor Leo I, repelled the attacks. Dengizic himself was slain in 469, his head displayed in Constantinople as a grim trophy. Ernach, the youngest son, fared slightly better. He established himself in the steppes north of the Black Sea, where his followers eventually merged with other nomadic groups. Some historians see in Ernach's lineage the seeds of later steppe confederations, such as the Bulgars. In this way, the Huns did not vanish entirely, but dissolved into new identities. For Europe, the dispersal of the Huns was both relief and transformation. Tribes once held in subjugation, Goths, Gepids, and others, now emerged as independent powers. The Ostrogoths would go on to carve kingdoms in Italy. The Visigoths strengthened their realm in Gaul and Spain. The Gepids ruled in the Carpathians, though only briefly before falling to Lombards and Avars. The Western Roman Empire, ironically, gained only a temporary reprieve. Though freed from Hun domination, it was still collapsing under its own weight. Within 2 decades, the last Western emperor would be deposed, leaving the map of Europe forever changed. The Huns themselves faded into legend. To their enemies, they remained the horsemen of terror, the scourge of God, who had humbled emperors and nearly toppled Rome. To later steppe peoples, they became ancestral figures, their memory woven into the identity of Turks, Magyars, and Mongols. Even centuries later, the name Hun evoked awe and dread. What had begun with small bands of nomads sweeping westward had ended in a storm of fire that reshaped the ancient world. Their empire burned brightly and briefly, but its echoes would reverberate through history. The death of Attila in 453 CE and the crushing defeat of the Huns at the Battle of Nedao in 454 signaled the end of their empire, but it did not erase their presence from Europe's imagination. For decades, refugees and survivors carried stories of the horsemen who had once seemed unstoppable. The scars left by the Hunnic invasions were not merely physical burned cities, shattered communities, depopulated valleys, but psychological. To the Romans, both east and west, the Huns became an embodiment of fear itself, a living reminder of how fragile even great empires could be when confronted by an enemy who refused to play by their rules. In the west, Rome limped onward after Attila's death, but its fate had already been sealed. The strain of paying tribute, raising armies, and repairing devastation accelerated its decline. The Western Roman Empire collapsed only 2 decades later, in 476 CE, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. To many contemporaries, the Huns had been one of the final hammer blows that weakened the empire beyond repair. They had not destroyed Rome outright, but they had battered it so badly that others could finish the work. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople endured. The city's mighty walls, resilience, and wealth had withstood Attila, but the memory of his sieges lingered. Eastern emperors never forgot the cost of Hunnic pressure. It was one reason they remained vigilant against later nomadic incursions. To them, the lesson was clear. The steppes were a permanent frontier of danger, and the horse peoples who lived there could never be ignored. The tribes once bound under Attila's banner, Goths, Gepids, Alans, Heruli, Rugii, emerged as new forces. They filled the vacuum left by the Huns' collapse, carving out kingdoms across Europe. These were the people who would shape the medieval world. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great would rule Italy. The Visigoths would expand in Spain. The Franks would rise in Gaul. And yet, in every clash and conquest, the spectre of the Huns remained, an echo of the storm that had swept across Europe a generation earlier. The Huns in memory and myth. Though the Hunnic Empire had collapsed, their legend only grew. To Christian chroniclers, Attila was remembered as the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. He was depicted as an instrument of divine punishment, unleashed to chastise sinful humanity. Sermons used his invasions as examples of God's wrath, turning historical trauma into spiritual warning. In the centuries that followed, European writers blurred fact and myth. Attila became a larger-than-life figure, sometimes cast as a barbarian demon, sometimes as a tragic hero. Medieval Germanic epics, such as the Nibelungenlied, transformed him into Etzel, a king who played a role in the heroic tragedies of Burgundian knights. These stories, though fictionalized, ensured that his name endured long after his empire was gone. Among later steppe peoples, the Huns took on a different role. Groups like the Bulgars, Magyars, and eventually the Mongols looked back on them as ancestral forebears. Though the direct lineage is debated, the cultural memory of a mighty mounted empire lingered across the Eurasian steppes. To claim descent from the Huns was to claim legitimacy, ferocity, and divine favor. Even centuries later, rulers invoked the name of Attila as a symbol of unstoppable might. The memory of the Huns also influenced European attitudes toward later nomadic powers. When the Magyars raided Central Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries, terrified chroniclers called them New Huns. When the Mongols swept into Eastern Europe in the 13th century, their cavalry tactics, speed, and ferocity drew immediate comparisons to Attila's riders. In many ways, the Huns became a template in the European imagination for the archetypal invader from the steppe. Archaeological discoveries add another layer to their story. Burial sites across the Carpathian Basin reveal elite warriors interred with weapons, jewelry, and horse gear, testament to a culture that valued mobility, martial prowess, and display. Skulls with deliberate cranial deformation, elongated in childhood as a mark of identity, have been found from Hungary to Central Asia, linking the Huns to a broader steppe tradition. These traces confirm that though their empire crumbled, their cultural fingerprints persisted. The fall of the Huns reshaped the map of Europe. By sweeping aside old barriers and destabilizing the Roman world, they opened paths for new kingdoms to emerge. Without the shock of the Hunnic invasions, the migrations of Goths, Vandals, Lombards, and others might have taken different courses. Europe's medieval landscape was, in part, the legacy of Attila's thunder, but the echoes carried further. For centuries, the word Hun remained synonymous with destruction. In later ages, enemies of Germany in World War I resurrected the label Hun as propaganda, linking modern foes to the terror of antiquity. The persistence of the term showed how deeply the Huns had embedded themselves in cultural memory, not as a people of nuance and complexity, but as an image of ruthless conquest. Yet the truth was more complex. The Huns were not merely destroyers. They were state builders who, in their brief time of dominance, forged one of the most formidable confederations the steppe had ever seen. They pioneered systems of tribute, diplomacy, and integration that influenced both enemies and successors. They forced Rome to adapt, to pay, and to negotiate in ways that altered the course of late antiquity. Their story was not just one of violence, but of transformation. As the centuries passed, the Huns faded into the currents of history. Their name lived on, but their people merged with others, absorbed into the great tapestry of Eurasia. Yet their impact remained permanent. They had proven that mobility, unity, and ferocity could topple giants. They had shown that empires were not eternal. They had reminded the world that the steppe, seemingly barren and remote, could produce storms powerful enough to shake civilizations. And so the story of the Huns closes. From obscurity on the Eurasian steppes, they erupted into history, terrified the greatest empire of their age, and vanished as suddenly as they came. Their reign was brief, but their shadow was long. Even now, more than 1,500 years later, we remember their name. They were the Huns. They were the scourge of God, and for a moment in time, they held the fate of empires in the palms of their hands.